Hey, everybody. Time for part two of the talk on tie cutting in the Uinta Mountains. So, part one, we kind of covered the broad history of tie cutting industry. Part two, we're going to dive a little bit more into the demographics because it's really a fascinating story. So, not a lot of archaeology here, but that's all going to influence our archaeological discussion in part three. So, without further ado, let's get started. So this cabin was actually built by a tie hack sometime around 1926, 1927. Today we call it the Huinta Guard Station, Hewinta, kind of a combination of Huon ties and Uinta Mountains, Huinta. This actually turned to a Forest Service administrative site by the early 1930s. And we actually have some of the best demographic information and some of the best oral histories because of the ranger that lived in this in the winter during the mid 1930s with his wife and small infant. Now, to put this in context, historians love historical records like censuses and diaries and insurance maps and all that stuff. The tie hacking industry of the Uinta Mountains, utterly vacant. It kind of existed in a no man's land between Wyoming and Utah. For political purposes, this was part of Summit County, Utah, based out of Colville. But for all intents and purposes, this was economically and culturally linked to Wyoming because most of the residents would go downhill into Wyoming to go to stores in Evanston or Robertson or Mountain View. So the census takers out of Wyoming didn't go into the Uintas because they're like, that's Utah. The Uinta census takers are like, I don't even know who these people are or how to even find them. So we don't even have census records. I went page by page, 1870, 1880, 1900, 1910 census with nothing. 1920 census, nothing. But we do have two hits that I want to talk to you about. And those two hits give us some context. But Ranger Archie Murchie and his memories give us a little bit of context. So, looking at his diary, you can actually see some mention of some of the demographics, some of the ethnicities being expressed. So, if you remember to talk one, phase two of the history of the tie hacking industry was really dominated by Scandinavians. And so, Swedes and Finns. These were those professional loggers that the Standard Timber Company brought in. Now, Archie Murchie reads this. So, they played all Scandinavian music and, of course, did Scandinavian dances. They had one dance they danced a lot. They called it Hambo, as close as I can pronounce it. They danced a lot, and most times they had a few whiskey bottles passing around too, which added to their good time. If you think about the lives of these tie cutters, they were up in the Uinta Mountains working 6 days a week, cutting down trees. Social and recreational activity was incredibly important. And these folks brought their cultural traditions from the north part of Europe to middle of nowhere, Utah. And so it kind of is cool to see this expressed, but I still needed to piece together more of this story. And so after exhausting the census records, I actually struck on a little cool thing: draft cards from World War One. So, as part of our efforts to get troops potentially mobilized to support the ongoing war in Europe, the United States government did a draft card enlistment. So, trying to get all adult males of age to register. So, these cards are available on Ancestry.com, and they were a gold mine to me. So where the census has failed, the draft cards gave me a lot. So these draft cards give me names, they give me age, they give me birthplace, they give me any physical issue they may have, like they lost an appendage or they have a bad eye, and sometimes even their specific occupation. And so as I started going through these one by one, I actually was able to find those labeled Black's Fork Commissary. And I'm like, hallelujah, there we go. So these draft cards give me an image. And if you look at this demographic chart, you'll see that 43 of those on the draft cards are actually from Sweden, and then Norway, then US, Bulgaria, Austria, Turkey, Finland, Russia, Germany, and Canada. And this gives us a good idea of the ethnicities and nationalities at play in the Uinta Mountains, a very diverse crew of folks. Now, most of these are, this is some of their first jobs here in the United States. They came here to work for the timber industry. And a lot of these guys were coming out of the timber parts of those countries, Sweden, Norway, and Finland in particular. So they had a skill set that they brought to bear. When you look at the occupations, you also notice that there was gradation here. So the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Austrians, and the Finnish were cutting the ties. They were the actual cutters. But the Bulgarians and especially the Turks were actually river runners. They're river rats. So they followed those seasonal floods and tried to break up dams caused from the railroad ties being caught on banks or debris. So there was like the ethnicities and nationalities also had categories that the Scandinavians were cutting the ties and the others were kind of helping them get downstream. Very cool. The next little glimpse we have is 1930 census. So this took a little bit of hunting because it's labeled as Henry's Fork Tie Camp. There are no tie camps on Henry's Fork. That, again, going back to part one of this lecture series, you remember that Henry's Fork dipped way into the Green River, way below Green River, Wyoming. And so it wasn't a place that you'd want to float ties for railroads. And there's no railroads downstream of the Green River until you get way down by Colorado. So this poor census taker was really lost. I think he actually was at the Steel Creek Commissary, and I'll show you some evidence of why I think that. But that census record is the only census we have of tie cutting up on the North Slope of the Uinta Mountains, which is pretty sad, but also kind of interesting because it does mean these guys lived in this weird gray zone. So you see, most of the people now, 15 years or so after those draft cards, were now from the United States, born here, but still big contingent from Sweden, Finland, Norway, Canada, and Germany. And you're like, oh, more Americans were in the industry. Yes, but the pattern continues. If you look at the pattern in the census records, which they track where your parents were born, guess what? The majority of those 32 American tie cutters were from, guess where? Sweden and Finland. So these were second generation loggers. These were second generation tie cutters, continuing a family trade, probably. And so that to me is a very cool story in and of itself. I want to highlight Brewer Eden just for a sec. So a few of these folks I can really track. These guys are wage earners. They're moving from job to job. They kind of exist outside the mainstream historic narrative. But Brewer Eden I was able to track. He was born in northern Sweden in a logging town, immigrated to the United States in early 1905, 1906, went right into logging industry. By 1916, 1917, he was one of the camp foremen at the Blacks Fork Commissary for the Standard Timber Company. And then he became a camp foreman up in the Wind River for the company. He returned to Sweden once and brought more guys with him after the end of World War I from Sweden. So this guy was a mover and shaker. He actually had a big family, and they moved around quite a bit. He ended up sadly dying in 1934 outside Fort Bridger, Wyoming, and is buried there. But his family continued. His one of his sons actually became a forester in Oregon, getting a formal forestry degree. So kind of the family business continued. I think it's a really cool story, but it also highlights a little bit of the dark side. Because of the harsh living conditions, harsh working conditions, Brewer Eden actually was reported to die of hardening of the liver, which is a code name for complications with alcoholism. But this is not an uncommon story for anybody in the American West in these hard scrabble towns making and earning a living. So Brewer Eden is an interesting part of our history, but it's nice to kind of dive into one person at least. And his family continues to have an impact on forestry today. So we think of logging as this masculine place with men in flannel and beards, but we also do the history disservice by not recognizing the potential role of women and children. Now, again, because we don't have a lot of demographic information other than those 2 points, the draft cards, which obviously weren't tracking women and children, and then one census, we don't have a complete picture. We do have that additional information from that tie company report from 1913. But this I thought is interesting. Ranger Murchie during those dances talked about, quote, there were no women in the camp. So they would take turns on who would be the women and who would be the men for dancing. Sometimes they'd tie a ribbon or handkerchief around the fellow's arm, and he was a woman. This kind of speaks to the lack of women in this particular setting, but we know from the census and report there were women. So I want to talk a little briefly about that. So that 1913 Standard Timber Company report, that first big wave of logging shows, yes, 161 men engaged in logging in one fashion or another, and 20 women. These 20 women were wives of most of the loggers. So we actually have some information that there was quite a few women in the camp. Now, these women not only were wives, but they also were probably getting paid as part-time cooks. helping with laundry and cleaning, helping to further the efforts of their husband, who was usually probably the camp foreman in one of these more isolated camps. So at least we have some presence of women. That 1930 census record, it expands a little bit. So we have 65 adult men, but we have 13 women and 20 children. That is a big component of children. This actually is why I think that the Steel Creek Commissary is what they recorded in 1930, excuse me, is because I know the Steel Creek Commissary, which is on Steel Creek, on Smith's Fork, kind of center part of the North Slope, they had a school. There was enough children to actually have a school there versus other camps where they had to still send their kids down into Wyoming to get an education. So that's why I think this is the Steel Creek camp that Archie Murchie stayed at and kind of wrote those remembrances. But the men and women here were contributing to the labor effort. Many of the children in Archie Murchie's remembrances actually run away from school if they were sent down to Wyoming and return to their families and help with the family business. Now, there was another small component. Archie Murchie also recorded a group of Okies. So that's a 1930s Great Depression era, speaking from people from that Oklahoma, Missouri area, the people that got really hard hit by the Dust Bowl. Now, he uses that in a fairly negative term, as many people did. They were seen as drifters, no accounts, not really an ideal population. And Archie Murchie continues that stereotypical perpetuation. But those, it was very clear the women and children were helping the men doing the tie cutting operation. So again, adding a little bit more color, a little bit more personality to the history. So that gives you a little bit more of a demographic input on the story. Part three will now take a more archaeological view. Like, how does all this history and demographics play out on the ground with the stuff we're seeing as archaeologists? So I hope you stay tuned for part three